I had always believed in the quiet power of community, in the subtle but essential threads of connection that bind us together as parents, as neighbors, as human beings, striving to create a nurturing environment for our children. My name is Clara Evans, and when my son Lucas, a bright, inquisitive, and endearingly earnest 10-year-old, started the 4th grade at the highly regarded Northwood Elementary School, I, like any devoted mother, was eager to immerse myself in the school community to contribute my time and energy to forge connections with other parents who shared my aspirations for our children's happiness and success. I had always been the type of mother who wanted to be involved not in an overbearing, intrusive way, but with a genuine desire to understand, to support, and to actively participate in the ecosystem that was shaping my child's formative years. I diligently attended every parent-teacher conference, my notebook filled with thoughtful questions. I enthusiastically volunteered for every school event, from flipping pancakes at the annual fundraising breakfast to chaperoning chaotic sugar-fueled field trips to the local pumpkin patch. I made it a point to learn the names of Lucas's classmates, their parents, even the school janitor and the kindly crossing guard. I believed with a steadfast, almost old-fashioned sincerity that being present, being engaged, being a part of the school community was just as important, if not more so, than simply supporting Lucas with his homework and packing his lunchbox at home. But from the very moment I first stepped into the hallowed and, as I would soon discover, surprisingly hierarchical halls of the Northwood Elementary Parent-Teacher Association, things began to feel off. Subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a faint discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. I initially dismissed my unease as my own insecurity, perhaps the natural awkwardness of being a relative newcomer in a well-established, tightly knit suburban community. Our family had moved to Northwood just the previous summer, drawn by its reputation for excellent schools and its picturesque, family-friendly atmosphere. I was still finding my footing, still learning the unspoken rules, the intricate social codes of this seemingly idyllic yet increasingly perplexing parental landscape. However, as the weeks turned into months, the subtle slights, the almost invisible acts of exclusion began to accumulate, to coalesce into a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult and, frankly, increasingly painful to ignore. Whenever there was an important PTA planning meeting, particularly those convened by the influential Executive Committee, a self-appointed and seemingly permanent cabal of immaculately dressed, impeccably coiffed, and unnervingly self-assured mothers who seemed to run Northwood Elementary with the iron-fisted, velvet-gloved authority of a benevolent yet unyielding oligarchy, I would more often than not be the very last to be notified, often receiving a hastily forwarded email just hours before the meeting was scheduled to begin, or sometimes not at all. My carefully considered, thoughtfully presented opinions and suggestions during the larger, more public PTA gatherings, ideas born from my genuine desire to contribute positively to the school environment, seemed to invariably fall on deaf or at least politely indifferent ears. The other parents, particularly those within the orbit of the executive committee's de facto leader, a woman named Victoria Ainsworth, would listen with an air of strained, superficial attentiveness. Their smiles fixed their nods perfunctory before seamlessly, almost dismissively, moving on to the next agenda item, my contribution vanishing into the ether as if it had never been uttered. It wasn't long before I realized with a dawning, sickening certainty that I was being deliberately, systematically, albeit usually quite subtly ignored, marginalized, excluded. I wasn't invited to the informal coffee clatches, the impromptu after-school playground strategy sessions, the exclusive evening wine and cheese planning meetings for the really important fundraising galas meetings that I soon learned through the hushed whispers of other similarly excluded parents, were where all the real decisions were made, where the PTA's agenda was truly set long before the performative charade of the official public meetings. Victoria Ainsworth was the undeniable queen bee of this exclusive Northwood hive. A woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in understated designer labels, her blonde hair always perfectly blown out, her makeup flawless. She exuded an aura of effortless, almost intimidating wealth and unshakable self-confidence. Her husband was a prominent local surgeon, their children a boy in Lucas's grade, and an older daughter were both, according to neighborhood lore, academically gifted and athletically prodigious. Victoria herself, while not officially holding any elected PTA office beyond hospitality chair, a title that seemed comically inadequate given her de facto power, was clearly the one who pulled all the strings. Her pronouncements, however, casually delivered, carrying the undeniable weight of established authority. She was surrounded by a tight-knit coterie of equally affluent, equally well-groomed, and equally exclusionary lieutenants. Women like Tiffany Brewster, whose husband owned a string of successful car dealerships, and Brittany Sinclair, a former city councilwoman with deep, influential roots in the local political establishment. They were the elites, as some of the other less connected mothers wryly and somewhat resentfully referred to them. My attempts to engage with Victoria to find some common ground, to perhaps even naively impress her with my genuine enthusiasm and my practical, well-thought-out ideas for school improvement, were met with a cool, appraising politeness that was in its own way far more dismissive, far more cutting than overt hostility would have been. She would listen, her head tilted at a carefully calibrated angle of feigned interest, her smile never quite reaching her cold, assessing blue eyes. And then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her posture, a slight turning of her shoulder, she would effectively, dismissively end the conversation, turning her attention to one of her more favored, more important acolytes. It was a masterclass in subtle social exclusion, a bloodless but brutal form of relational aggression that left me feeling small, insignificant, and increasingly deeply frustrated. The initial vague sense of unease I had felt upon entering the Northwood PTA world began to solidify into a more concrete, more painful understanding. I was an outsider, and it seemed with a clarity that was both disheartening and strangely liberating that Victoria Ainsworth and her elite clique were determined to keep me that way. The reasons I could only surmise were a complex, unspoken cocktail of perceived social status, financial standing, and perhaps a fundamental, almost tribal unwillingness to cede even a fraction of their carefully hoarded power and influence within the school community to a newcomer, especially a newcomer like me, a working mother with a modest income, a slightly less than fashionable wardrobe, and a distinct lack of influential connections or a designer handbag collection. My crime, it seemed, was simply not being one of them. I didn't live in the right gated community. I didn't drive the right luxury SUV. My husband Tom was a dedicated, respected, but hardly wealthy high school history teacher. My volunteer efforts, while sincere and tireless, were perhaps seen as too earnest, too practical, lacking the requisite veneer of effortless charitable chic that characterized the elite's own, often more performative contributions. The whispers which had initially been so subtle I had almost convinced myself I was imagining them, now grew louder, more pointed, more undeniably directed at me. I would walk into the school cafeteria for a PTA bake sale I had spent hours baking for, and conversations would abruptly cease. Heads would turn, and a sudden, uncomfortable silence would descend, broken only by the forced, overly bright greetings of a few more independent-minded or perhaps simply kinder parents. I started to hear through the concerned, hesitant reports of one or two of these more sympathetic acquaintances the specific derogatory and often entirely fabricated remarks being circulated about me. Remarks almost always originating, or at least significantly amplified, by Victoria Ainsworth or her closest confidants. Comments about how I was trying too hard to fit in, about how my ideas for the school fundraiser were a little unsophisticated, about how my son Lucas was a nice enough boy, I suppose, but perhaps a little rough around the edges compared to their own perfectly polished offspring. They, even with a breathtaking, almost comical pettiness, dissected my second-hand car, my slightly less than designer clothes, even on one memorable occasion recounted to me with horrified disbelief by another mother the perceived inadequacy of the store-bought cookies I had once in a moment of exhausted desperation contributed to a class party. It was clear I was not just being excluded. I was being actively targeted subtly but systematically by a group of women who, for reasons I couldn't fully comprehend, seemed determined to make me feel unwelcome, inadequate, an outsider in a community I so desperately, so genuinely wanted to be a part of. Not for my own social gratification, but for the sake of my son, for the sake of contributing meaningfully to his educational experience. The unseen labor of my love, my dedication was not just being ignored, it was being actively cruelly devalued. The whispering walls of Northwood Elementary were beginning to feel less like a supportive community and more like a hostile, judgmental, and increasingly isolating prison. As the weeks of that first challenging school year at Northwood Elementary bled into months, the subtle, insidious campaign of exclusion orchestrated by Victoria Ainsworth and her elite clique against me, Clara Evans, escalated from a series of almost deniable social slights into a more overt, more systematic, and undeniably more painful pattern of deliberate marginalization. The Buktung Vohin invisible wall I had initially sensed had now solidified, become almost tangible, a palpable barrier that effectively and cruelly separated me from the influential inner circle of the Northwood PTA, and by extension, from many of the key decision-making processes that directly impacted my son Lucas's school experience. My attempts to contribute meaningfully, to offer my time, my skills, my genuinely well-intentioned ideas, were now being met not just with polite indifference, but with a new, more chilling form of almost bureaucratic obstruction. If I volunteered to help organize a major school event like the annual spring fair or the holiday book drive, my name would mysteriously be overlooked when the committee lists were finalized, or I would be relegated to some peripheral, almost invisible and entirely inconsequential task, like sorting donated used clothing in a dusty back room, far removed from any actual planning or execution. If I submitted a carefully researched proposal for a new after-school enrichment program, something I had spent weeks developing based on feedback from other less vocal parents, it would be received with thanks by Victoria or her lieutenants, only to then vanish without a trace, never to be mentioned, let alone discussed or considered in any subsequent PTA meeting. The social ostracization also became more pronounced, more blatant. I was no longer just being forgotten when invitations to the elite's exclusive coffee clatches or evening planning sessions were sent out. I was now, it seemed, being actively, almost performatively shunned. At school pickup, if I happened to be standing near a group of them engaged in animated conversation, their voices would invariably drop to conspiratorial whispers as I approached. Their laughter would cease abruptly. Their backs would subtly but unmistakably turn towards me, creating a physical as well as an emotional barrier. At larger school functions like the back-to-school night or the science fair, where a modicum of general parental mingling was expected, they would offer me at best a curt, almost pained nod of acknowledgement, their eyes flicking past me as if searching for someone, anyone more worthy of their attention, before quickly pointedly moving on to greet another more acceptable parent with an effusive, almost theatrical display of warmth and camaraderie. It was a masterful, if deeply cruel, campaign of social exclusion, designed, I had no doubt, to make me feel so unwelcome, so insignificant, so utterly out of place, that I would eventually, in frustration and despair, simply give up, withdraw from all PTA activities, and retreat into the isolated anonymity of my own quiet, unpretentious life, leaving them to their unchallenged, self-congratulatory dominion over the Northwood Elementary social and political landscape. The emotional toll of this relentless, insidious bullying, for that is what it was, I finally painfully allowed myself to admit, was immense, far greater than I ever let on, even to my supportive husband Tom or my closest friends outside the Northwood orbit. I had always considered myself a strong, resilient woman, not easily swayed by petty jealousies or playground politics even at the adult level. But the constant daily barrage of subtle slights, of dismissive glances, of overheard cutting whispers began to chip away at my self-confidence, at my innate sense of worth, like water slowly, inexorably eroding stone. I found myself dreading those PTA meetings I had once approached with such genuine enthusiasm, such a sincere desire to contribute. I would sit in the back of the room, feeling like an awkward, unwelcome interloper, my carefully prepared notes clutched in my sweating palms, my voice, when I occasionally dared to speak, sounding small, hesitant, almost apologetic, even to my own ears. I began to second-guess my own ideas, to question my own judgment. Was I perhaps, as they so clearly seemed to believe truly, not good enough? Were my suggestions genuinely unsophisticated? Was my desire to be involved merely a product of my own overzealousness, my own need to prove something? Their insidious campaign of psychological warfare was, I realized, with a growing, sickening dread beginning to work. I was starting to internalize their negative perceptions, to doubt my own value, my own capabilities. The stress, the constant feeling of being judged, of being on the outside looking in, began to seep into other areas of my life. I became more irritable at home, my patience with Lucas and Tom wearing thin more easily than usual. My sleep was often troubled, filled with anxious dreams of being lost, of being invisible, of trying desperately to speak, but finding no one would listen. The joy I had once found in my freelance design work, my creative outlet began to wane, my concentration, fractured my inspiration, muted by the pervasive low-level hum of social anxiety and a gnawing sense of injustice. And then there was Lucas, my bright, sensitive, and increasingly observant son. He was, after all, the primary reason I was subjecting myself to this ongoing, soul-crushing ordeal. I wanted to be involved in his school, to advocate for his best interests, to ensure he had every opportunity to thrive. But I began to fear, with a new, chilling intensity, that my own social ostracization within the parent community might inadvertently be negatively impacting him. Children, I knew, are incredibly perceptive. They pick up on the unspoken currents, the subtle shifts in adult dynamics, with an almost preternatural acuity. Had Lucas noticed the way Victoria Ainsworth or Tiffany Brewster would offer me a cool, dismissive nod while simultaneously bestowing a dazzling, effusive smile upon his classmate, young Chadwick Ainsworth, or little Penelope Brewster? Had he overheard the hushed, critical whispers about his trying too hard mother from the other children on the playground, echoes of the conversations their own parents were undoubtedly having at home? Was he perhaps beginning to feel a sense of shame, of embarrassment by association with his increasingly marginalized, uncool mother? The thought that my own social struggles might be causing him even a moment of discomfort, of playground anxiety, was almost more than I could bear. It added another, almost unbearable layer of guilt and frustration to my already overburdened heart. This wasn't just about my feelings anymore. This was about protecting him. The final, definitive Jiat Nuk Tranli, the drop that made the cup overflow, the incident that finally irrevocably shattered my attempts at stoic endurance and propelled me towards decisive, if terrifying, action, occurred not at a PTA meeting, not in the school hallways, but at what should have been one of the most joyous, most community-affirming events of the school year, the annual Northwood Elementary Spring Carnival. I had, despite my growing disillusionment, volunteered weeks in advance to run the Lucky Duck Pond game booth, a traditionally popular, if somewhat unglamorous station that always delighted the younger children, including my own Lucas, who at 10 was still young enough to find a simple, unadulterated joy in hooking a plastic duck and winning a cheap, brightly colored trinket. I had spent hours preparing, sourcing new, more appealing prizes, even hand-painting a cheerful, welcoming new sign for the booth. On the day of the carnival, a bright, sunny Saturday, I arrived early, set up my booth with meticulous care, and waited with a forced, determined cheerfulness for the first wave of eager children. And they came in droves, their faces alight with excitement. For a few blissful hours, I almost forgot about the PTA politics, about Victoria Ainsworth, about the whispering walls of Northwood Elementary. I was just a mom helping out, sharing in the simple, infectious joy of a community event. Then around mid-afternoon, Victoria Ainsworth herself, in her official capacity as hospitality chair and de facto carnival overlord, swept by my booth, flanked by her usual retinue of fawning lieutenants Tiffany and Brittany. She was doing her rounds, ostensibly to ensure everything was running smoothly, but more accurately, I suspected, to bask in the reflected glory of her organizational prowess, and to dispense a few carefully chosen words of praise or subtle critique as she saw fit. She paused at my Lucky Duck Pond, her gaze sweeping over my cheerful hand-painted sign, my meticulously arranged prizes, the long, happy line of children waiting their turn. I offered her a polite, hopeful smile. Perhaps I thought with a sudden naive surge of optimism, perhaps today, in this atmosphere of community joy, she would finally see my genuine effort, my sincere contribution. Instead, she turned to Tiffany Brewster, who was standing beside her, and said in a stage whisper that was clearly deliberately intended for me and for anyone else within earshot to overhear, "Goodness, Tiffany, that duck pond looks rather quaint, doesn't it? Almost amateurish. Perhaps next year we should assign someone with a bit more flair to this particular station. Someone who understands the importance of a truly polished presentation even for the little ones. First impressions, you know." She then offered me a condescending, dismissive little pat on the arm, a gesture that felt more like a pat on the head of a slightly dim-witted but well-meaning pet, and swept on her entourage tittering in her wake, leaving me standing there amidst my cheerful plastic ducks, my carefully chosen trinkets feeling a wave of such profound public humiliation, such utter soul-crushing defeat that I thought I might actually be sick. It wasn't just the insult itself, though, that was certainly cutting enough. It was the casual cruelty of it, the deliberate public nature of the put-down, the clear, unmistakable message that in her eyes, in the eyes of the Northwood PTA elite, Clara Evans, would never, ever be good enough. My efforts, however sincere, however tireless, would always be deemed amateurish, quaint, lacking in the requisite flair. Lucas, who had just run up to my booth, his face beaming a newly won plastic spider ring, clutched proudly in his hand, saw the look on my face, saw the tears welling in my eyes, despite my desperate attempts to blink them back. His own smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion, then dawning worried concern. "Mommy?" he asked, his small voice filled with an anxiety that mirrored my own. "Are you okay? Did Mrs. Ainsworth say something mean to you?" And in that moment, looking at my son's worried, innocent face, a new, unfamiliar, and incredibly powerful emotion surged through me, an emotion that burned away the humiliation, the despair, the years of carefully suppressed resentment. It was rage, a cold, clear, and utterly unshakable rage. Not a hot, impulsive anger, but a deep, resonant, and profoundly righteous fury. Enough was enough. I would not endure this any longer. I would not allow these petty, cruel, and power-hungry women to diminish me, to define me, to hurt my child with their insidious, toxic games. My silent suffering was over. My quiet, desperate hope for acceptance was extinguished. In its place, a new, far more formidable resolve was born. The revolution, my own small personal revolution against the tyranny of the Maple Street elites, was about to begin. That evening, long after the last remnants of the spring carnival had been cleared away, long after Lucas had finally fitfully fallen asleep, his earlier worried questions about Mrs. Ainsworth's mean words temporarily soothed by my vague reassuring but ultimately untruthful dismissal of the incident as a silly misunderstanding, I sat alone in the quiet, darkened solitude of my living room. The usual post-event exhaustion was there, a dull ache in my muscles, a weariness in my bones. But overriding it, eclipsing it entirely, was a new, unfamiliar, and strangely energizing emotion, a cold, clear, and utterly unshakable righteous fury. Victoria Ainsworth's casual public cruelty at the duck pond had not, as she perhaps intended, crushed my spirit. It had instead inadvertently served as the final definitive catalyst, the spark that ignited a long, dormant, smoldering ember of defiance within me. I would no longer be their silent, ignored, and conveniently available scapegoat. I would no longer endure their petty tyrannies, their exclusionary tactics, their soul-crushing condescension. I was done being a victim. I was done hoping for their acceptance. An acceptance that I now realized with a painful, liberating clarity would never, ever be forthcoming, not on their terms, not in their carefully constructed hierarchical world. My decision forged in the crucible of that public humiliation and fueled by a mother's fierce protective love for her child, for I knew instinctively that my own continued marginalization would inevitably negatively impact Lucas's experience at Northwood, was not to simply withdraw to retreat into sullen, resentful isolation, as they perhaps expected, as they perhaps even desired. No, my decision was to fight back, not with their weapons of choice. The insidious whispers, the backhanded compliments, the exclusionary social maneuvering, but with my own, with truth, with logic, with evidence, and with the quiet, often underestimated but ultimately formidable power of collective action. The next morning, I woke with a new, almost unnerving sense of clarity and purpose. The usual morning fog of weariness and resignation was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused, almost exhilarating determination. I knew this would not be an easy battle. Victoria Ainsworth and her elite clique were deeply entrenched their influence within the Northwood PTA and by extension with certain members of the school administration seemingly absolute. But I also knew with a certainty that resonated deep within my soul that I was not alone in my frustrations, in my feelings of being marginalized, of being unheard. There had to be other parents, other mothers, other fathers, who, like me, felt a similar sense of unease, of disquiet, with the current state of affairs at Northwood Elementary, with the cliquey, exclusionary, and often deeply undemocratic way in which the PTA was being run. My first most crucial task was to find them, to connect with them, to transform our individual silent frustrations into a collective, audible, and ultimately undeniable voice for change. I started cautiously, discreetly. I remembered Maria Rodriguez, a quiet, kind-faced mother of a boy in Lucas's class, a woman who, like me, had recently moved to Northwood and who always seemed to sit alone, looking slightly lost and overwhelmed at the back of those chaotic PTA meetings. I had noticed on more than one occasion the way Victoria Ainsworth would offer Maria a cursory, almost dismissive nod, her attention already elsewhere before Maria even had a chance to speak. I approached Maria during school pickup a few days later, my heart pounding, a nervous tattoo against my ribs. Maria, I began, offering her a warm, genuine smile. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to chat over coffee sometime this week. I've been feeling a little out of the loop with some of the PTA activities lately, and I thought perhaps you might be feeling a bit the same way. Maria looked up, her dark, intelligent eyes widening slightly in surprise, then softening with a flicker of something that looked remarkably like relief. "Oh, Clara," she said, her voice a soft, lilting accent. Yes, I would like that very much. To be honest, I often feel completely invisible at those meetings. Like my opinions, my experiences simply don't matter to them." She gestured vaguely, almost fearfully, towards a group of the elites who were at that very moment engaged in an animated, exclusive-looking conversation near the school gates. Our coffee meeting a few days later at a small, quiet cafe, far removed from the usual Northwood parental haunts, was a revelation. As I tentatively shared some of my own experiences of being excluded, of being subtly undermined by Victoria and her clique, Maria's story, her own litany of similar and in some cases even more blatant slights and dismissals, came pouring out. She too had tried to volunteer to contribute only to be met with a wall of polite indifference, of condescending gatekeeping. She too felt that the PTA was being run not as a democratic, inclusive organization for the benefit of all students, but as a private, exclusive club for a select, privileged few. Encouraged by Maria's immediate, heartfelt solidarity, I then cautiously approached David Kim, the quiet, thoughtful, and actively involved single father of a girl in Lily's, my daughter, from a previous story, now seamlessly integrated as Lucas's older sister, giving Clara another child to fight for grade. David, a successful software engineer, was one of the few fathers who regularly attended PTA meetings, often offering insightful, well-reasoned suggestions only to see them more often than not politely ignored or subtly ridiculed by Victoria and her inner circle, who seemed to view any male parental involvement beyond writing a generous check to the annual fund as a slightly amusing and ultimately irrelevant novelty. David, when I shared my concerns with him during a chance encounter at the local library, listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Clara," he said finally, his voice tight with a controlled anger. "I hadn't expected you're not imagining things. What you're describing. It's been going on for years. Victoria Ainsworth runs that PTA like her own personal fiefdom, and anyone who doesn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable, anyone who challenges her authority, however subtly, is either marginalized or actively pushed out. My own attempts to get involved with the school's STEM enrichment program were met with such a by-lay barricade of bureaucratic nonsense and passive-aggressive resistance from her committee that I almost gave up in sheer frustration. It's not about the kids, Clara. Not for them. It's about power. It's about control. It's about maintaining their own exclusive, self-congratulatory social hierarchy. Through Maria and David, and then through their own networks of other quietly disgruntled, similarly marginalized parents, our small, informal coffee clatch of 2, then 3, began to grow. We started meeting discreetly in each other's homes after the children were in bed, our initial hesitant conversations slowly, cautiously evolving into more focused, strategic discussions. There was Sarah Chin, a different Sarah Chin, a recurring name for a supportive friend archetype in these narratives, a working mother who was tired of being made to feel guilty for not being able to volunteer during school hours. There was old Mrs. Henderson, the neighborhood matriarch, who despite her age and frailty still possessed a razor-sharp mind and a deep, abiding sense of fairness, and who, had she confided with a twinkle in her eye, seen more than her fair share of petty tyrants like Victoria Ainsworth come and go over the years. There was even a former member of Victoria's own elite clique, a woman named Jennifer, who had recently and rather acrimoniously fallen out of favor after daring to question one of Victoria's more outrageous fundraising proposals, and who was now with a convert's zeal eager to share her insider knowledge of their manipulative tactics and their often questionable decision-making processes. Our small, diverse, and increasingly determined group, united by a shared sense of injustice and a common desire for a more equitable, more inclusive, and more genuinely child-focused school community, began to formulate a plan. We knew we couldn't defeat Victoria Ainsworth and her entrenched power base through direct emotional confrontation alone. That would only play into their hands, allow them to paint us as hysterical, disruptive, negative. No, our strategy had to be more intelligent, more methodical, more insidious in its own way. We decided to focus on 3 key areas, meticulously gathering concrete, undeniable evidence of the PTA's current lack of transparency, its exclusionary practices, and its often questionable allocation of resources, systematically building a broader coalition of support amongst the wider, often silent majority of Northwood Elementary parents, who we suspected also felt a similar, if less overtly expressed, sense of disenfranchisement. And finally, preparing a comprehensive, well-reasoned, and legally sound proposal for a complete overhaul of the PTA's outdated bylaws, its opaque decision-making processes, and its exclusionary leadership structure. A proposal we would then, when the time was right, present directly and with the undeniable weight of collective parental power to Principal Albright and the Northwood Unified School District Board. Clara Evans, the once marginalized, once invisible mother, was no longer alone. With the quiet, determined support of Maria, of David, of Sarah, of Mrs. Henderson, of Jennifer, and a growing number of other similarly disillusioned parents, she was now almost without realizing it at the forefront of a burgeoning grassroots movement, a quiet suburban revolution. The Ngonlua flame of resistance, once just a tiny defiant spark within her own heart, was beginning to spread to catch, to illuminate the shadowy corners of Northwood Elementary's parental power structure. The game Victoria Ainsworth would soon discover was about to change dramatically and irrevocably. Our newly formed and still somewhat clandestine Northwood Parents for a Fairer Future coalition, as we had somewhat grandiosely, yet with a shared, determined conviction begun to call ourselves, spent the next several weeks engaged in a meticulous, almost forensic campaign of information gathering and strategic planning. My living room, much to Tom's amused if slightly bewildered resignation, became our unofficial late-night headquarters, the air often thick with the aroma of lukewarm coffee, the low hum of earnest, passionate discussion, and the rustle of photocopied PTA minutes, school budget reports, and hastily scribbled notes. Our first and most crucial task was to gather concrete, undeniable evidence of the existing PTA's exclusionary practices, its lack of transparency, and what we strongly suspected were instances of questionable, if not outright improper, allocation of hard-earned fundraising resources. This required a multi-pronged approach. Maria Rodriguez, with her quiet, unassuming demeanor and her surprising knack for navigating bureaucratic labyrinths, took on the task of meticulously reviewing years of publicly available PTA meeting minutes, financial statements, or lack thereof, as was often suspiciously the case, and school district policies regarding parental involvement and fundraising. She discovered a disturbing pattern of decisions being made in executive session, with little or no subsequent public disclosure of significant expenditures being approved with minimal debate or oversight, and of a consistent, almost comical overrepresentation of Victoria Ainsworth's elite clique on every influential committee, every decision-making body. David Kim, with his sharp analytical software engineer's mind, focused on creating a detailed data-driven analysis of PTA membership volunteer participation rates and the demographic makeup of the current PTA leadership compared to the broader school parent population. His findings, presented in a series of clear, compelling charts and graphs, painted a stark, undeniable picture of a deeply unrepresentative, almost oligarchic leadership structure, one that effectively and systematically excluded vast swaths of the parent community: working parents, single parents, parents from more diverse ethnic or socio-economic backgrounds, and indeed anyone who didn't quite fit the narrow, unspoken, but rigidly enforced mold of the Northwood elites. Jennifer, our insider informant, proved to be an invaluable, if sometimes uncomfortably candid, source of information regarding the inner workings, the hidden agendas, and the often petty personal rivalries that fueled Victoria Ainsworth's reign. She provided us with copies of private email exchanges between executive committee members revealing a disturbing pattern of decisions being made based on personal preference, social expediency, or a desire to maintain their own exclusive grip on power rather than on the genuine best interests of the students or the broader parent community. She even, with a certain grim satisfaction, recounted specific instances where viable, innovative proposals from outsider parents like myself had been deliberately, almost gleefully sabotaged or dismissed out of hand by Victoria and her cronies, simply because they hadn't originated from within their own closed, self-congratulatory circle. My own role, in addition to serving as a sort of de facto coordinator and a reluctant but increasingly confident spokesperson for our burgeoning group, was to focus on the human element, on gathering personal testimonies from other parents who had, like me, experienced firsthand the sting of exclusion, the frustration of being ignored, the quiet humiliation of being made to feel less than by the PTA's ruling clique. I spent hours on the phone, in quiet coffee shop meetings, in hushed playground conversations, listening to their stories, validating their feelings, and gently, persuasively encouraging them to add their voices, their experiences to our growing body of evidence. It was an emotionally draining but incredibly rewarding process. With each new story shared with each new parent who bravely agreed to sign an affidavit or provide a written statement, our collective strength, our shared resolve, grew stronger. We were, I realized with a dawning, almost awestruck sense of wonder, no longer just a handful of disgruntled individuals. We were becoming a movement, a quiet, suburban, but nonetheless potent force for change, united by a common desire for fairness, for transparency, for a school community where every parent's voice, every child's well-being truly mattered. The web of truth we were meticulously, painstakingly weaving was becoming stronger, more resilient, and increasingly, undeniably more dangerous to the established, complacent, and deeply unjust status quo at Northwood Elementary. Victoria Ainsworth, in her arrogance and her complacency, had no idea of the storm that was quietly, inexorably gathering just beyond her gilded exclusionary gates. After several intense, focused weeks of meticulous evidence-gathering, strategic planning, and late-night coffee-fueled meetings in my increasingly cluttered living room, our Northwood Parents for a Fairer Future coalition, now numbering close to 50 active committed members, felt ready to make our first decisive move. We had amassed a formidable dossier: Maria Rodriguez's damning analysis of the PTA's opaque financial dealings and exclusionary meeting practices, David Kim's irrefutable data showcasing the unrepresentative nature of its leadership, Jennifer's insider revelations of backroom deals and petty power plays, and my own collection of over 24 heartfelt signed affidavits from parents detailing their personal experiences of being marginalized, dismissed, or outright bullied by Victoria Ainsworth and her elite clique. Our case was strong, our resolve unshakable, our unity a quiet but potent force. Our agreed-upon strategy was not to launch an immediate all-out public assault, which we knew could easily backfire, allowing Victoria and her allies to paint us as disruptive, unreasonable agitators. Instead, we opted for a more measured, escalating approach, designed to first demonstrate the breadth and depth of parental dissatisfaction, and then, if necessary, to apply increasing pressure on the school administration to intervene and facilitate meaningful change. Our first official action was to collectively and very publicly raise our concerns at the next scheduled Northwood Elementary PTA General Meeting. This was a meeting that in the past had been a largely performative, sparsely attended affair, with Victoria Ainsworth presiding with an air of bored magnanimity, the agenda predetermined, any dissenting voices quickly and skillfully silenced or ignored. This time, however, would be different. Word had subtly, strategically spread through our newly formed network, and on the evening of the meeting, the school cafetorium, usually half empty for these events, was packed to capacity. There was a palpable buzz in the air, a sense of anticipation of something significant about to happen that was clearly unsettling to Victoria and her usual entourage, who exchanged nervous, surprised glances as they took their customary seats at the front table. When the floor was opened for new business, I, as the designated spokesperson for our coalition, calmly but with a voice that resonated with a newfound, unwavering confidence, stood up. Madam Chair, members of the PTA, fellow parents, I began my gaze sweeping across the room, acknowledging the supportive nods from our allies, and meeting Victoria Ainsworth's suddenly very attentive and distinctly unamused stare. A significant and growing number of parents here at Northwood Elementary have expressed serious and well-documented concerns regarding the current operational transparency, financial accountability, and overall inclusivity of this parent-teacher association. I then proceeded for the next 15 minutes to calmly, factually, and with supporting evidence readily available, though I did not at this stage present at all, outline the key areas of our collective concern. The lack of accessible detailed financial reporting, the perception of a closed exclusionary decision-making process dominated by a small unelected clique, the consistent dismissal or marginalization of new ideas and volunteer efforts from parents outside that inner circle, and the overall feeling amongst many that the PTA in its current iteration was failing to adequately represent or serve the diverse needs and interests of the entire Northwood Elementary parent community. The reaction from Victoria Ainsworth and her lieutenants was predictably one of feigned outrage, of dismissive condescension. Victoria herself, after recovering from her initial visible shock at the sheer number of parents now openly challenging her authority, attempted to regain control with her usual tactics of patronizing charm and veiled intimidation. She spoke of her years of dedicated selfless service to the school, of the immense, often thankless efforts of her executive committee, of the unfortunate misunderstandings that can sometimes arise in any volunteer organization, and then, with a chilling, dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand, attempted to shut down the discussion, stating that these were internal PTA matters not appropriate for such a public forum, and that any legitimate concerns should be submitted in writing through the proper channels. But this time her usual tactics failed. Her dismissiveness was met not with cowed silence, but with a rising murmur of dissent from the assembled parents, a clear, audible expression of their shared frustration, their refusal to be silenced. Maria Rodriguez then stood up, her voice trembling slightly, but her message clear, to share her own personal experience of being marginalized. David Kim followed, presenting a concise, powerful summary of his data on the PTA's lack of representative leadership. One by one, other parents, emboldened by our collective courage, began to speak out, sharing their own stories, their own frustrations, their own demands for change. The meeting, which Victoria had clearly expected to be another routine, easily controlled affair, rapidly devolved into a chaotic, passionate, and deeply uncomfortable but ultimately profoundly empowering public airing of long-suppressed grievances. By the end of the evening, it was abundantly clear to everyone present, including a visibly shaken Principal Albright and Athletic Director Henderson, who had been in attendance as ex officio members, that the status quo was no longer tenable. The Maple Street Moms Revolution, as one local newspaper reporter who had been anonymously tipped off about the potential for fireworks at the meeting would later somewhat sensationally dub it, had well and truly begun. In the immediate aftermath of that tumultuous PTA meeting, Victoria Ainsworth and her elite clique, clearly rattled by the unexpected and very public display of widespread parental dissatisfaction, attempted to regroup to consolidate their power to discredit me and the other leaders of our burgeoning movement. There were insidious behind-the-scenes attempts to paint me as a power-hungry troublemaker, a disgruntled newcomer with a personal vendetta. They spread rumors that I was trying to destroy the PTA, that I was not a true team player, that my actions were harming the school's reputation. They even, with a breathtaking pettiness, tried to use their influence with some of the local businesses that had traditionally sponsored PTA events to pressure them into withdrawing their support, hoping to financially cripple any potential new initiatives our group might propose. But their efforts this time largely backfired. Their tactics, once so effective in the shadowy realm of private whispers and exclusionary cliques, now seemed transparently desperate, almost pathetic when exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The more they tried to attack me personally, the more they inadvertently highlighted the very issues of arrogance, of elitism, of a refusal to acknowledge legitimate concerns that had fueled our movement in the first place. Our coalition, far from fracturing under the pressure, only grew stronger, more united, more determined. We responded to their smears not with reciprocal mudslinging, but with calm, factual rebuttals, with a continued focus on the systemic issues, on the need for greater transparency, accountability, and inclusivity. Principal Albright, to her credit, and likely under considerable pressure from the district superintendent's office, who had undoubtedly been made aware of the escalating situation by concerned school board members, recognized that she could no longer afford to remain a passive bystander, no longer allow the PTA to operate as Victoria Ainsworth's personal, unaccountable fiefdom. She called for an emergency closed-door meeting between herself, Mr. Henderson, Victoria Ainsworth, in her official capacity as PTA Hospitality Chair, though her de facto power was far greater, and myself, along with Maria Rodriguez and David Kim, as representatives of our concerned parents group. That meeting, held in the principal's somewhat cramped book-lined office, was the true turning point, the moment the balance of power at Northwood Elementary began to irrevocably shift. Victoria Ainsworth, deprived of her usual fawning audience, her usual ability to control the narrative through sheer force of personality, seemed diminished, almost defensive. We armed with our meticulously compiled dossier of evidence, with the undeniable mandate of a significant and growing portion of the parent community, calmly, rationally, but with an unyielding firmness presented our case directly to Principal Albright. We detailed the lack of financial transparency, the exclusionary decision-making processes, the pattern of favoritism, the culture of intimidation that had for too long characterized the Northwood PTA under its current informal leadership. We didn't just present problems, we presented solutions. We offered a detailed, well-researched proposal for a complete overhaul of the PTA's bylaws for the establishment of new, clear and democratic procedures for electing officers, for managing finances, for ensuring that all parental voices, regardless of their social standing or financial contributions, were not just heard, but actively solicited, respected, and incorporated into the decision-making process. Victoria Ainsworth predictably tried to argue, to deflect, to minimize. She accused us of misunderstanding, of exaggerating, of undermining years of dedicated volunteer work. But her protests in the face of our calm, factual presentation, and in the presence of a now clearly very concerned and increasingly impatient Principal Albright rang hollow, self-serving, almost desperate. By the end of that long, emotionally draining but ultimately transformative meeting, Principal Albright, a woman who, whatever her past acquiescence to the PTA elites, might have been clearly valued order, fairness, and the overall well-being of her school above all else, made her decision. She announced in no uncertain terms that she would be personally overseeing an immediate comprehensive review and restructuring of the Northwood Elementary PTA. She thanked Victoria Ainsworth for her past service, a clear if polite signal that her reign was effectively over, and announced that pending the adoption of new, more democratic bylaws and the election of a new, truly representative executive board, all major PTA decisions and expenditures would require her Principal Albright's direct personal approval. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. The elite clique's stranglehold on the Northwood PTA had been broken. The path was now clear for genuine, meaningful, and lasting reform. The ensuing weeks were a whirlwind of activity, of renewed hope, of collaborative effort. Our Northwood Parents for a Fairer Future Coalition, working closely with Principal Albright and a newly formed, diverse, and genuinely representative ad hoc committee of other interested parents, drafted a new set of PTA bylaws that enshrined the principles of transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and democratic governance. We organized open forums, solicited feedback from the entire parent community, ensuring that every voice, every concern, every suggestion was heard and considered. And then, at a special school-wide PTA meeting, a meeting attended by an unprecedented, almost overwhelming number of engaged and energized parents, the new bylaws were presented, debated, and ultimately adopted by an almost unanimous vote. Elections for a new PTA executive board were held shortly thereafter, conducted under the new, transparent, and democratic rules. And I, Clara Evans, the once marginalized, once invisible mother, the woman who had been so casually dismissed as quaint and amateurish, found myself, to my own enduring surprise and profound humility, elected as the new president of the Northwood Elementary Parent-Teacher Association. Maria Rodriguez was elected vice president. David Kim became our new treasurer. Our revolution, our quiet suburban revolution, had succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. The transformation within the Northwood Elementary parent community, and indeed within the school itself, was palpable, almost immediate. The old exclusionary cliques, deprived of their power and their platform, began to dissipate, replaced by a new, vibrant, and genuinely inclusive spirit of collaboration and shared purpose. PTA meetings, once sparsely attended, often dreaded affairs, became lively, engaging, and productive forums for open discussion, for creative brainstorming, for genuine community building. Parents who had once felt silenced, marginalized, now stepped forward with enthusiasm, offering their unique talents, their diverse perspectives, their invaluable time and energy to a multitude of new, innovative, and truly child-focused initiatives. A revamped school literacy program, a community garden project, a multicultural arts festival, a peer mentoring program for new families. Victoria Ainsworth and her former elite lieutenants, stripped of their unearned power and their self-appointed status, largely faded into the background, some choosing to withdraw from PTA activities altogether. Others, perhaps humbled by their fall from grace, eventually cautiously beginning to re-engage in more modest, less overtly controlling ways. There was no public shaming, no overt acts of retribution from our end. Their loss of influence, their quiet descent into relative obscurity within the school community, was in itself a far more potent and far more lasting consequence than any direct confrontation could ever have achieved. My own role as the new PTA president was both exhilarating and daunting. I had never sought a position of leadership, never craved the spotlight. But I embraced the responsibility with the same dedication, the same quiet determination, the same unwavering commitment to fairness and inclusivity that had fueled my initial solitary fight against injustice. I worked tirelessly alongside my wonderfully diverse and dedicated new executive board to foster an environment where every parent felt welcomed, valued, and empowered to contribute, where every child's well-being was truly, unequivocally the central guiding focus of all our collective efforts. Lucas, my dear son, the unwitting catalyst for this entire unexpected journey, watched my transformation. My emergence as a community leader with a mixture of quiet pride, youthful awe, and perhaps a dawning, more mature understanding of his mother's previously unrevealed, or perhaps simply undemanded strengths. He no longer saw just Mom, the provider of snacks and the enforcer of homework. He saw Clara, the woman who had faced down bullies, who had challenged an unjust system, who had, through courage and conviction, made a real, tangible, positive difference in their shared world. And that, I knew, was a lesson far more valuable, far more lasting than any I could have ever taught him from a textbook. My story, the story of the Maple Street Moms Revolution. As that one slightly sensationalist newspaper headline had so memorably, if somewhat inaccurately dubbed it, became a quiet legend within our Northwood community. A testament not to my own personal ambition or a desire for vindication, but to the profound transformative power of ordinary individuals, of concerned parents who, when united by a common purpose, by a shared sense of justice, dare to speak truth to power, dare to challenge the status quo, dare to believe that a better, fairer, more inclusive world is not just a distant utopian dream, but an achievable, tangible reality forged, one courageous conversation, one collaborative effort, one small, hard-won victory at a time. I hadn't just reclaimed my own voice. I had, in some small, unexpected way, helped to amplify the voices of countless others, creating a chorus of change that resonated far beyond the walls of Northwood Elementary, a legacy of empowerment, of community, and of the enduring, unshakable strength that can be found when we dare to stand together for each other and for our children.